Scott Goldman, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while, so this should be good.
Yeah, look, me too. I was actually fortunate enough. We've both been guests on Dan Abraham's podcast. You have at least had a hat trick, maybe 4 appearances on that show. Dan's been a guest on the show, but after listening to 2 of your episodes with him, I wanted to get in touch and get you on. It's super interested about the work you've been doing, the teams you're working with, and what you're seeing in the world as well out there in sports psychology and just teams and stuff in general. But I'd love to just start with, most people, even athletes, always start with where they came from and their journey into what they do, and whether it's as a sport, as an athlete, as a coach, as a psychologist. So for you, where did your journey start? Literally start wherever you want to start there.
Yeah. Let's see. So I was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and most people don't have a reference point there, right? Like they go, I kind of know what a New Yorker's like, or I know what a person in California or the US. Once you throw New Mexico out there, it almost, you get like that weird dog look where they're like,
Yeah.
And so let's just start off with a little shout out to New Mexico. It is a hidden gem, beautiful mountains, great people. I am definitely missing home right now. It depends who you ask, but I did play what we call in the United States soccer. You all call European football. You call football. But I try to downplay that, because with some of the athletes that you and I interact with on a day-to-day basis, to show them my sport pedigree is laughable, because it just pales in comparison. But I was part of the Olympic developmental program. I played semi-professional soccer through grad school. And that, I guess, is kind of the origin story of my professional career. Is I had always been fascinated in human behavior and in psychology in general. And really, I wanted to work with children. I was actually doing an Outward Bound program with troubled youth in New Mexico. So we'd take them rock climbing and hiking and stuff. It was really amazing, impactful work. So I was playing soccer, working for troubled youth. I've always been fascinated in psychology. And I was like, I wonder if there's a way to blend these 2 worlds, psychology and sport. And I kind of discovered this universe. And then I spent most of my early years just developing training and education so I could be a resource for teams, people, and organizations. I got 2 PhDs. One's in clinical psychology. So that's the emotional distress and the pathology stuff that, I think is incredibly important work. Then I got another PhD in school psychology, which, again, if you think about like coaches as teachers and players as learners, so I found that kind of relationship dynamic. The school psychology degree really played into that. And then, if that wasn't stupid enough, kind of doing a double like that, I ended up going over to the exercise science kinesiology department and taking a bunch of advanced coursework so I could understand human performance. And then I kind of quadrupled down and started to take graduate level training in business management, because I started to understand like the organizational structure and organizational psychology being an important aspect. So I think because I was just passionate about being a sports psychologist, I was thirsty for all of these different domains and advancing and studying these different domains, not realizing, like, I don't know how you feel, but for me, I don't feel like the work is that hard, but I do think the work is complicated. And to really understand the complication is to understand all these different kinds of mechanisms of service we can provide.
Yeah, I usually describe my work as incredibly simple, but not easy to answer.
That's right.
And that's on both levels. That's both for you working with a client, but also as someone from asking whether it's a genuinely simple question to an athlete. So if it's something they're going through today I had a call with one of my athletes, right? They're low on confidence. They not ready as they're not in as good a spot as they would like to be. Just very high expectations, outcomes not where they want it to be. It's pretty standard like behavior for a lot of athletes, right? My expectations are up here and I'm not meeting them. But the questions I ask is like, okay, well, if you were literally to give this to give advice to someone going through your challenges that you've got right now, what would you say? And then you just see the cogs unfolding. And I sit there and I go, that was not a complicated question, but the answer is actually a little bit more difficult. And how we get there is then the part of the puzzle we got to try and get to. And I think that's where a lot of people end up getting shocked at the work, is that they're like, oh my God, I didn't realize it could be this easy in the sense of what you're asking. But then to get there, I think the actual doing, both from say your side and from an athlete side, the actual doing of the work is another different level. Like that's another different kettle of fish.
Yeah. And what I think is so fascinating is even the nature of your question, it almost becomes, how do we categorize it, right? Like, was that a clinical question? Was that a performance question? Because it's interesting. Albert Ellis, who, was the creator of rational motor behavior therapy, one of the most highly regarded clinicians of modern time, he had something that he called a friend dispute, which was exactly what you put into play, which was, imagine your best friend was going through this situation. What advice or guidance would you offer? But then you have other people like Ken Ravizza, who's known as one of the great, sports psychology consultants, who also would engage in a similar kind of question, but from a more performance-driven paradigm. So I think what's really interesting is going back to, it's not a hard job, but it is a complicated one, is where do you pull really good empirically validated practice from? Because I think sometimes if people are trained in more of like a one-dimensional skill set, they might, it's the old adage, like if you are a hammer, you treat everything like a nail. So you ask that question, if you were clinically trained, you might take a more pathological route based off of where that answer leads to. If you're more performance-driven, you might take a more optimal kind of coaching path. And I'm going like, I think both have a tremendous amount of merit and benefit.
How do you figure out with your athletes which one to take? How do you know which one they would prefer? Because I'll take it from my point of view. Putting my boots back on as an athlete, and I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I wanted to go and talk to a psychologist. I wanted to work with them. But I also wanted a relationship with this person because I wanted the barriers of clinician and athlete to be broken down, that I also didn't feel that it was going to impact selection. It was going to impact what the manager or the coach thought of me. There was still, I think, even I'm talking between 2010 to 2016, there was still a bit of a stigma here in the UK of if you were seeing a psychologist. It still exists now. I still see it, hence why a lot of athletes will come to me rather than actually in-house. It's because they don't want to be seen going through that door. But going through that door and then working with the athlete, how have you found which approach to take when you know, okay, does this person actually want more clinical help? Do they want the performance help? Do they just need some form of counseling here in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, no, you're asking a great question. I think because of the skill set, trying to possess a level of expertise or competence in all three of these buckets, right? Performance, clinical, and system design. I try to do the best I can to create a space that the person who I'm dialoguing with, whether it's a player, a coach, or a front office personnel, can utilize that space for what they want to do and go in the direction that they want to go in. So I don't know, I'd be curious your thoughts on this. I have found in our industry, there are people who are kind of like answer guys. And that's what they do. They have a lot of confidence. Some, I would even go so far to say arrogance. But what they do is they have a way to really resonate with key decision makers where they provide an answer. And the utility of it and the way I see it working is, when you're a head coach and you don't have a lot of peers, like you can't ask people on your staff because they're subordinates about certain topics. And you can't go to your other, the brotherhood of coaches. Like you can't go to the other head coaches because they're also, as much as they are your allies in certain topics, they're also your competitors in others. So I'll give you a great example would be like, let's say a coach is really struggling with a player. Well, they don't want to tell another coach, from another team that they're struggling, because now that's an opportunity to maybe like try to, further create a wedge, and then they can maybe, trade or get that player on their team, talented player. And you also can't necessarily go to the position coach and be like, hey, I don't know how to get to this guy, because again, there's a hierarchy chain of command there. So I think the answer guy can come in and say, here's what you should do with the player, and gives them great confidence and clarity, because as you know, leadership can be very vulnerable. Like, I find leadership folks are supremely talented, which is how they got to where they got to. And so when they have a puzzle that they can't answer on their own, it becomes a really unique and special puzzle, because they answer all the simple stuff due to their high talent. So sometimes they're so taxed by the system, overstimulated, because everybody wants 5 minutes of their time, they will love an answer dude. Just tell me, like, what shoes should I put on today? I'm overwhelmed with decision making. And the guy, the answer dude goes, hey, put on the green shoes. Thank you. You simplified my life. Let's go. The risk of the answer dude is they often come from a level of confidence, but not necessarily a level of competence. So they'll go, you got to go with the green shoes. And if you query the answer guy, hey, why did you go with green? And they'll go, oh, it made sense to me because X, Y, and Z, almost personal, anecdotal reasons or something else, but not based off of science or any real kind of sophisticated understanding, which means it's a little bit of a crapshoot as to whether or not they called it right. The other option, and I tend to go the other route, is I try to create a space. Hey, let's create a space where you can ask meaningful questions like what you just did, and see if we can get you to feel more confident. You're already competent. That's why you're a leader. Now let's see if we can get you to feel more confident in your own process. What are the obstacles? What are the things that are blocking you from going ahead and executing the decision? What are the dilemmas? And if I were to ask the right question, or the question guy or gal were to ask the right question, could it help you get to a place where you feel more convicted in direction that you want to go? I have found that to be a more powerful intervention. The only asterisk to it is it requires some time and space. And sometimes these coaches don't have that.
Because they want to get answers straight away. They want the world is fast moving and results driven. Yeah,
because no matter what, the game is played at 7:00 tonight. They can't reschedule the game because they need to have a meeting with you. Like, even if the starting all-star superpower best player on the team gets a flat tire, they still start the game exactly at the time that everybody agreed it's going to start. So there is this perpetual shot clock that I think causes us to speed up everything that we do.
It's interesting there you talk about that confidence and competence. I think my experience personally, and with guys that I see now, and we can get onto confidence as a topic, is I see a lot of athletes thinking they want performance confidence to perform well in the moment, but actually they kind of need self-confidence. They need confidence in themselves, and actually they are good enough to make, or worthy enough to make the right decision, to do what they do well. Whereas I think they think that if I focus on the actual performance and I execute this, that it's going to make me worthy. Where I kind of feel, and I felt that before, like I felt if I perform well and I achieve these goals, then I will feel, undoubtedly I will improve how I feel about myself because I've gone after something and I've achieved it. But it still felt, it left this hole of me as a person, and actually I don't feel like I don't know, the self-confidence within me is still not there, because I've not addressed some part of my life that is outside of the sport. That it could be just making that confidence of putting on the right clothes to go out to a dinner or whatever it is, rather than actually the performance, the confidence that I have within a game. Yeah, I've always seen this self-confidence in themselves and this performance confidence that they're striving for. And sometimes they can have all of that, because I've seen athletes that have all the performance confidence in the world, but then they're actually not massively self-confident people. Yeah, I don't know. What are you seeing in the world of confidence at the moment?
Well, so my dissertation was on confidence and confidence induction. And, I'm now of the generation where I'm old as dirt, especially in the world of sports. So I'm like, back in my day, we used to have to check out books. But so my dissertation, which was a wonderful education, right, might be a little bit outdated. But at the time, I had to first define confidence. Like part of the dissertation process was I was like, okay, what is the definition of confidence? And what was fascinating to me was, though it was mentioned in the literature, though it was mentioned in the research countless times, it was never really defined. So I tend to start with a concept where I go, okay, between you and me and all the listeners that are tuning in, I would start with, what's your definition of confidence? Because I don't think we have a uniform one. So let's ask you, and then I'll throw my conceptualization of it right now, though it tends to mutate. What's your definition of confidence?
Again, it's something that I've been thinking about. I mean, I've gone into Bandura's self-efficacy and seen that side of it, because you just see them interchanged all the time. But I think for me, it links purely with authenticity for me, that I'm doing things defined by I'm making decisions based on me authentically making them. I'm not making them in fear of other people, in fear of judgment, in fear of some expectation. I'm purely doing something because I feel competent to do that, and that I gain enjoyment out of that process for just purely being me.
So that's cool. I have not heard somebody fold authenticity into the definition before. And I think that's a really neat capture, really neat capture. I don't know if you saw, I had a little bit of like a flinch. And the only reason that is I wrote an entire chapter in the dissertation about self-efficacy and Albert Bandura. It took me 3 months. It was 60 pages. And so like we did a deep dive, right? And my dissertation sponsor, Rich O'Brien, God rest his soul, brilliant man. I love that dude. He, in 30 seconds, right? 3 months, 60 pages, all kinds of research. In 30 seconds, he goes, yeah, this doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the dissertation. I think we need to go in a different angle. And he just scrapped it.
Wow.
And I flipped out. I was like, what are you doing? Like, I was so pot committed to it. I was like, we need to put it in there just because I had already done the work. Like, and he goes, look, he goes, and here's the brilliance of it. And this line that he gave me actually makes, because I've used this line so much that it made the return of investment, even though the Bandura section got scrapped from the dissertation, his explanation for why and gave me an ability to accept it was this one line. And he just said it with such a shrug and then kind of walked away like, our conversation's done. It's out of the dissertation. As he goes, sometimes you just got to go down dead ends to know they're dead ends. I was like, all right, fair enough.
It's a 60-page dead end.
And 3 months, right? 3 months that I can't get back. I think about what I could have done in those 3 months instead of. But my definition of confidence is, I think it's a belief state. So it's funny how you kind of tied in authenticity and you also tied in competence. I actually think competence can influence confidence, but confidence is more of a belief state. Like, I can confidently think I can fly without any skill set in doing so. And I could be so disillusioned in my confidence that I would jump off a cliff hoping to, like, say, build my wings on the way down. So I think of confidence, one, as a belief state. But the other part, which is where my dissertation was really focused on, was it's a physiological belief state. And what do I mean by that? And so it's interesting, right? Like, we've studied anger, and we know that, like, when people get angry, their heart rate changes, their mouths will clench, their muscles will tense. Like, there is a physiological reaction to anger. Same thing with anxiety. I mean, if you ask somebody to somatize their anxiety or to describe their anxiety, it is a lot of biophysiological stuff. Like, my heart's beating out of my chest, or my stomach is doing, backflips. So when I came up with a construct, because I couldn't find a pre-existing definition, I went with two backbones. One was belief and the other was physiology. And so it was interesting because people are like, well, what's the physiology of confidence? And that's the funny part, right? When you talk about players, you say, tell me a time, when you talk with players, you go, tell me a time where you felt supremely confident. Mm. They will talk about like flow state or just how good they felt, but they tend to overlook the feeling state. And I don't mean an emotional feeling. I mean physiological feeling state where they'll go, oh, like my muscles felt strong. I felt fast. And then all of a sudden you start to go, okay, we can actually induce that. The same way, like you can have someone imagine sucking on a lemon and it makes their mouth salivate, even though there's no lemon anywhere near them. In fact, it just did it to me just now. I'm like, lemon. But we can induce, like that's the beautiful brain-body relationship dynamic, right? Like, and it's been going on for since the origin of philosophy, right? Like Spinoza and Descartes and all these other folks. Like when we start to think about the mind-body dualism stuff, what's fascinating to me is if the mind truly believes it, the body will react as if it is true. So we can get somebody to salivate on a lemon, even if, or sorry, salivate on the image of a lemon, even though there's no lemon in their mouth. So I think what's interesting is it's easier when you've had an experience of competence to rely on. So you go, okay, like I remember that time when I scored 50 points in a game, or I remember that time where I scored a hat trick. And I remember how I felt and I can recreate that experience. But what's really interesting, if you look again at like operant conditioning, you know, like Mowrer's two-factor theory of avoidance and stuff. And I can go down this rabbit hole if you want me to. I can get super nerdy on this stuff.
Go wherever you will need to go.
Okay. So Mowrer's two-factor, like it's like Inception. We're doing like discussion within a discussion within a discussion.
Yeah.
Mowrer's two-factor learning theory talks about how fear states are classically conditioned. Like, for example, a critical incident happens. I get bit by a dog, and now I've been classically conditioned to be afraid of a dog. But they get magnified, that fear gets magnified through operant conditioning, which is when I avoid dogs, I feel better, which then strengthens the bond between my fear state and dogs in general. So there is a critical incident that happens, and then by avoiding anything that is remotely like said critical incident, my fear gets worse. So you can do that in reverse, right? There's a critical incident, like I hit the game-winning shot, then now all of a sudden I engage in more game-winning shots and I feel more and more success. I've always theorized like there is some benefit to grabbing a veteran player who's won a championship from a different team and bringing them into a young organization that has no reference point, just so they can look to him or her and say, what was it like when you won? So you can artificially, the same way you can artificially do Mowrer's two-factor learning theory to get more anxious, you can go the other direction and kind of artificially inflate levels of competence. Where things get really complicated, like I said, the job's not hard, but doing it is complicated. Where things get kind of complicated is, what do you do when the environment can be a critical incident in both? You hit the game-winning shot, and now you're confident. Well, now you've missed the game-winning shot, and now you have the opposite. You have all that doubt. And so what I find is really interesting is just the sheer fact that, and I'll use basketball, you know, let's say you're a 43% field goal shooter. Well, statistically speaking, you're going to miss more shots than you make. You're going to miss, 6 out of 10. So you're more likely to have a moment of failure than a moment of success when the game-winning shot moment occurs. So kind of putting a bow on all of this, and man, you are a great listener. I hope other people are still engaged, because sometimes I can go on these like rants. But to kind of put a bow on it is, more people come to folks like us when they have the doubt and the struggle than they do when they're going like, hey, things are going good and I just want things to be better. And that becomes this idea of like, all right, so you start to look at what was the critical incident? What was the defining moment that started to give you perspective? And then are we amplifying it to be more confident, or are we trying to offset it because we're trying to remove?
So I wanted to ask here. So I'm really interested. There's a few things. I've taken a couple of notes here just because I want to circle back to a couple of things. So the physiological response to it, I think, because anxiety and confidence are just, in my opinion, are going hand in hand, right? I've always said, I believe in an athlete, if you can ultimately get to the equation where you find a way to reduce your anxiety, confidence will somehow increase. Because if there's a reduction in the other, or anxiety sometimes can cloud that confidence that you have. So what I'm curious about is obviously nerves, anxiety, frustration, anger, stress, they all have a physiological response. So how do you tune people and athletes who are currently in that state of worried about this critical moment, and you want to get them into that state of confidence? What is the mechanism that you would use to get there? Is it some form of like exposure type therapy to almost like systematically trying to put them in these confident positions, throwing them in the deep end? Which way are you trying to get there?
Yeah, great question. And the challenge of exposure is like, how do you get people to be exposed to game-winning shots that have substantive meaning outside of the actual game-winning shot that has
creating the feeling of that consequence. I tried to do it a lot of the time in my career. It's so difficult. It really is,
without a doubt. So going back to my dissertation, one of the things that I discovered was there were all kinds of what they called incompatible response type treatment. So you have like Jacobson's progressive muscle relaxation and Wolpe's reciprocal inhibition. And really what it's all about is when you're feeling a physiological state of distaste, like anxiety or anger, you shut them off with something that's incompatible. The example that I often give to athletes is like, you can't flex and relax a muscle at the same time. It's just impossible. So when someone's tense, what you want them to do is you want them to engage in an activity. That's why like people are so into mindfulness and being present, is it's really like, hey, let's just relax here a little bit. Where I question not mindfulness literature, because I think there's great stuff there, but how some people are using it. And the same thing that happened with like Wolpe and Jacob and all the whole progressive muscle relaxation stuff it was all about relaxation. And as you know, when an athlete is relaxed, that can be something that induces underperformance. There has to be some kind of arousal state.
Yeah.
So I came across a really interesting study. It was actually Bandura. So part of that 3 months.
You managed to bring it back in.
There's my trauma. But
one page got back in.
Yeah, well, it did actually. So what happened was there was a really neat study that he engaged in. So what he discovered was, what he hypothesized was that there's multiple incompatible responses besides relaxation that could engage as an incompatible response to anxiety. So for example, hunger. If you haven't eaten in 2 days and you're afraid of snakes, and there's a snake pit with a beautiful looking pizza, you might overcome your fear of snakes in order to grab a slice. The other one was like sexual drive. Like, if you are madly in love with, and there's a handful of celebrity women that we could use that I have crushes on, but my wife might listen to this. So just say, why don't we just say like my wife, like my beautiful, lovely wife, who I'm madly in love with. And you can replace with whoever you want in your narrative. Well, if I was afraid of a snake and this person that I was strongly attracted to is wearing a snake around their neck, well, if she's saying, come over here and give me a hug and a kiss, I might overcome my fear of snakes in order for that pursuit of engagement. So looking at this research, I'm like, God, this is really fascinating. And then I came across something that Bandura did with children, where what he did was he had kids that were afraid of being alone and being in the dark. He had them go to an isolated area with a walkie-talkie, and he told them that they have to wait for a phone call from one of their superheroes. So it was like Batman, Superman kind of thing. And they found that the kids who were engaged in this sort of fantasy role play of the superhero needing their help, and they had to just wait for the phone call, that they engaged in the noxious stimuli longer. And as you know, with exposure, the longer you're exposed to the thing that you're afraid of, the faster it goes away. You have an extinction that occurs. So taking all of this nerd talk and saying, okay, how do you put it into sport play? I think, well, let's go back a step into the nerd world. There's a guy named Richard Swin who came up with a theory called anxiety management training. And what he theorized was, he had two, anxiety management training and anger management training. What he theorized was, if you can't get into the scenario or unpack the trauma, all you have to do is have people tune into the physiological sensation. So instead of asking them, what are you angry about? You just say, I know I'm angry because I'm clenching my teeth. And rather going like, well, what are you angry about? Let's unpack that. It's like, okay, you recognize the physiological cue. Now you got to let it go and turn it off again. Relaxation kind of stuff. What's interesting was he originally called it a competence, anxiety competence training instead of management. And what he came up with as a concept, Swin, was if people were competent, they could use the competent experience to make them to use as an incompatible response. So in other words, it's like, man, I have all this self-talk, I'm a loser, and I'm anxious about failing this, game or business transaction. And he would say, well, think about the last time you were successful. You really crushed it. Now use that kind of thing. What's interesting was Swin eliminated that because he was working with chronic patients, and his concern was chronic patients might not have too many successful experiences to come up with. And I was like, well, but most athletes have at least one or two moments, especially when you're working at the elite space. They've had many. So one of the things, sorry, it's such a long answer to such a brilliant question. So what do I simply do? When someone has all this doubt, and again, they've got this critical incident, I go, okay, tell me about the physiology of that moment. What did it feel like? How do you feel when you think about it? What kind of comes up? And they'll talk about bile in their mouth or their stomach drops and all that. And I go, okay, good. Hold that sensation. Hold it, study it, understand it. Now, let it go. Let me know when it fades away. Okay. Now, tell me a time where you were supremely successful, where everything just felt right and good. Now, what did that physiological sensation feel like? Hold that. Study it. Now let's go back and forth between those two for a bit. So hold it, study it, let it go. Hold it, study it, let it go. Once you feel like you can kind of induce both states, the same way like I want you to think about a lemon and it makes you salivate. Once you can induce both physiological states, I want you to turn on the anxiety state. Once you got it, now use the confident state to turn off the anxiety one. And what I'll do is, again, I'm super low tech. I'm just like, raise your hand. Once you've got that anxiety state, raise your hand. Great. Now use the confident state, feeling state, belief state, and memory to turn it off. And when the anxiety is gone, just lower your hand.
How long does that take to get them to that stage?
So it's
or is it completely independent in the person?
So when I engaged in it scientifically, the mode was one session. It was amazing because once the extinction occurred, it was it. That was it. They were good.
Would that be because it's so quick? Because they're almost, and I know you were talking about mindfulness, but just bringing their attention to those two all different states, they hadn't brought the awareness to both at the same time or intermittently. And it was the fact that they were living in, whether it was this high anxiety, huge fear state for so long, they just hadn't addressed or hadn't even acknowledged that confident state. Because I think it's really easy to just allow confidence to kind of just happen and go, and you don't actually acknowledge what got you there, how it felt. I don't think athletes do that enough. I think it's when you're riding high, it's really easy to get back home, get on the bus, do whatever, and just kind of move on from that game and go, well, the next game's going to be brilliant. It's going to be awesome. But reality, you haven't actually engaged in, well, how do I feel? What's going on? What's everything that I'm saying to myself? All that side of it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So again, mode was one, but mean was like anywhere between 4 to 8 sessions of the experience. What was interesting was I did a 3-month, 6-month, and 1-year follow-up, and it didn't return.
It didn't return?
It did not return.
That's wild.
Totally. So now let's go back to the question that you just asked, which was sort of like, well, if you don't mind, can you rephrase the question?
I don't really feel like it was a question. I feel like it was just talking about how, or even this would be something I'd lean into with your work in NBA, NFL, MLB, and saying, do you find that enough athletes are engaging in their confident state, that they are acknowledging their strengths of when things have gone well, when moments have happened in their favor and they've had a great game, that they've acknowledged it, they've reviewed it, they've embraced it, rather than moving on and just going, that was a great game, everything's all fine and dandy, the next game will be good anyway?
So there is some research that supports that we tend to remember our bad beats more than our wins.
Yeah.
And there's some that believe in the evolutionary psychology concept, which evolution psychology I think is fascinating, but it's hard to verify because it's not like we can actually capture. But the concept was that we are hardwired to remember pain more so than we are to remember our victories. Because the idea is like, if you found a tree that produced fruit, that's a win. But there's many trees, and you can survive an extended period of time without a win every moment. But if you got attacked by a lion or bit by a snake or fell off a cliff or anything else that could kill you or significantly injure you, like that's a one-time shot. There is no, well, I'll try again tomorrow. So if there is some truth and we are kind of hardwired to remember our failures more than our successes, I think you're right that less people will evaluate when things are good. They just feel like, oh, that's the state I'm supposed to be in. And I think what's also kind of interesting and influencing the modern athlete is social media, where people are only posting positive content, where people are only showing, it's like the ESPN effect, right? Like they only show the shots that go in. They don't show the shots that go out. And on social media, it's even more so. Like we only show, beautiful moments in waterfalls and beaches and stuff. We don't show like, oh, I'm sitting here by myself, lying in bed in a hotel, crying in my pillow. Like that's not what we post, even though most human beings have some wide variety of experiences in life, from the epic, beach scene to the lonely hotel moment. So I think what's really fascinating about this thought process and this work or this engagement is, again, dialing into and accepting that we remember more of our hardships than our wins, but that both exist within us. And then it becomes this idea of, I find that in the world of sports, when we can somatize or basically put an emotional state into a body part, like asking people to talk about their psyches is better now than it was 10, 15 years ago. But asking someone about their knee or their ankle, they'll gladly engage in that way more than the psyche stuff. So once you start to talk about neurons and neurons firing and chemistry and chemical release, dopamine and serotonin and all of this kind of adrenaline and, endorphins, it becomes something where you just go like, hey, this feeling state, you can just accept and ignore. That's what real mindfulness and acceptance and commitment therapy, like that's the essence of it, right? It's just to say, okay, I'm feeling anxious now. I can accept that and kind of just let it be in the back of my mind. Like, I think the phrase that Stephen Hayes called it was monsters on the bus. If you're driving a bus and there's a bunch of monsters on the bus, you just focus on driving it, ignore the monsters. It's like, okay. Then there's those like RABT and Albert Ellis that say, hey, let's dispute the monsters, try to get them out of the bus, knock them off the bus. And I'm going like, well, we can go either route or even a third option, but let's just focus on the physiology of it. If you're not feeling good, how do we get you into a feel-good state? Now, I've taken it more of a academic and maybe a more sophisticated intellectual approach in describing it in this conversation. But when I'm engaged with players or executives, I tend to use a lot more like metaphors or simplified language, just so that it's more digestible.
Yeah, I mean that's just a technique of the work of just being able to get that across. That's probably the. I mean, athletes sometimes just don't need it too complicated. They just need it. Just tell me straight, tell me how it is, so I can figure out a way to get a better relationship with those monsters, whatever it might be.
That's right.
Look, I'm really interested in some of the work that you're doing right now with teams, and we've talked about confidence as being a current subject, but in the teams that are so high level that you're working with, there's a lot going on. Obviously, the drafts just happened in the NFL. We'll get on to the AIQ, but there's also the NBA going into playoffs, and that's all very exciting. It's a mad world that's going on. In moments, both, I guess, trying to figure out how best to position this, but let's take NBA for the moment. When everything's really high octane, there's a lot of eyes on it now. Everything's about getting to the end and winning the trophy. What in your world, what do you see your role as being in that part?
Sometimes I would make the argument the role is to get out of the way. And it's funny because people be like, really? And I'm like, yeah, like, you got to eliminate noise. You got to help kind of amplify the signal, the focus. My experience during playoffs in general, whether it's NBA, NFL, or any of the other spaces and domains that I've been in, is like, this is where we need to kind of like there's just less goof around, less like, it's really about like, all right, I got to brush my teeth, I got to shave, I got to get to practice, I got to have meaningful, purposeful practice. Like, it's really about dialed in. So sometimes I almost feel like it's the things you don't do that can have most impact. Because now's not the time to unpack doubt. Now's not the time to unpack anxiety. Now's not the time, like whether we're talking performance or clinical or anything else, like now's not the time to really process. Now's the time to do. So I almost feel like the work should be done up to this point. Now, with that said, people are going to come to you with, hey, can we just ratchet this up a little bit? Can we just kind of twist this out a little bit? And so, you get like a phone call in the middle of the night kind of thing, or a text message with, hey, doc, what do you think about? And so, but I tend to try, like, it's almost like, if you're tinkering with a race car, you don't take out the engine, like maybe you replace some tires, maybe you fill up the gas when they come in to the pit crew, but you don't do massive overhauls or anything like that.
So the follow-up to this is, out of all the teams you've worked with, you've got some incredibly impressive athletes that you've worked with and that have been in the rosters of those teams. What do you see as being the commonality amongst those really elite and the super elite? So we'll call the super elite those consistent practitioners, those consistent performers, the ones that will really get the headlines consistently, may get more trophies than the others. Do you see those guys engaging in this work, engaging in the psychological, the mindset work compared to the others? And then is there something that really triggers it for those others to get to that place?
I find the best athletes I've ever been around, the ones that have gotten closest to a sense of mastery of their craft, they will use anything and everything that they feel will make them better. And what I've discovered is that there are those athletes that do everything. right? They're like, I do everything just to make sure, so I'll only eat like, skinless chicken breasts, and I'll only and I'll sleep on hyperbaric. Like they do everything, and they have no idea what is actually contributing most to their performance. And then there are other athletes where it's almost the opposite, where it's like, I don't want anything else. Like what I do works, and I'm just gonna like keep doing that. And so when you ask like how many do you use it, it would be easy and great for our profession if I were to promote it and say like, oh, the best athletes use this stuff. But I think the reality is the best athletes I've been around, the ones that are closest to mastery of their craft, they figured out what works for them. And sometimes that includes a psychological process, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it includes good nutrition, sometimes it doesn't. Like these dudes are just wired differently. They're different dudes, and they're special. And their origin story is so complex that it's not repeatable. I find what's fascinating is we sometimes look for simple answers, right? So it becomes one of these things like carbohydrates are bad, proteins are good. Now we all should go eat protein. And then all of a sudden everybody kind of calibrates to that. And the best athletes still differentiate themselves despite the fact that everybody's eating protein instead of carbohydrates. Or it's, remember a few years ago, sleep. It was all about sleep. Best athletes are getting sleep. So now everybody's getting sleep. Well, the best athletes still have to differentiate themselves from the fact that that's now been neutralized. Competitive advantages, regardless of what they are, get neutralized. So you go, okay, well, at the core, what is the X factor? So I don't have a simple answer for that. And if anybody else does, like they should bottle it and sell it. And I think there's a bit of con to it. So I'm not going to be the first guy here to say I've got the answers to the test, because I think anyone who does like should go to Vegas or anything else. Like it should just be like a known commodity. Like why hold it to yourself? Like one of my pet peeves are these guys that call themselves like the secret weapon. Hey, I was the secret weapon of this particular player. And it's like, gosh, if you made that player so great, why did you only help one guy? Why didn't you get that secret sauce to everybody that you've had contact with? Like, and so I think if I were to provide one universal insight, but I'm not saying it in totality. I know universal and totality are kind of interchangeable, but one observation that I found with the best players I've ever been around is they have such a passion for their sport, for their craft, almost obsessional, that they put countless hours into it. Now, what's interesting is it's almost like, I don't know when you're airing this, but today's May 4th. So let's celebrate Star Wars. May the 4th be with you. What's interesting about the light side and the dark side of the Force is it's not intended to be good versus evil. It's actually like enlightenment versus passion. And I think there's something really fascinating about that, because some of the most elite athletes, I think, are actually tortured souls. That they are compelled to greatness.
That is a really great point, and something that I mentioned continuously about some of the most elite athletes that I've seen, and I say elite. So when I'm saying elite, it doesn't necessarily mean they are the fittest, the strongest, the fastest, the quickest. The sports we're talking about, there are some elements of that where they do need to be physically fit. But the majority of the sports we're talking about, there's high skill involved. And when skill goes up, the necessity of physicality doesn't necessarily always go with it. You could be a highly skilled batsman in my sport, cricket, but you wouldn't necessarily have to be massively skilled. You could be the best free throw shooter or 3-point shooter in the NBA. Yes, fitness will get you to play more games, maybe reduce injury, fatigue less at the clutch moments, but your skill level is dependent on other factors. And I think when those guys, so when I say elite, you don't necessarily have to think of this like totally ripped, incredible athletics, different story, like different story in athletics. How do we get this body from A to B quicker? But the guys that I've seen, they embrace this dark side of them. They almost don't even see it. They almost don't even understand it. They're incredibly flawed. I've played with athletes that are borderline alcoholics, but they're incredible when they cross the line, and they are obsessed with it. They'll train at a different level. They'll put themselves into positions that make them challenged, but also they risk a lot when they go into those moments and they're training. And they've almost embraced these flaws about them. And it's through that not willingness to embrace those flaws and try to be like everyone else. I think that's where a majority get lost. I think I fell into that category early on in my career. I tried to be like my heroes. I tried to be like people that I wanted to be like, when actually I didn't really. That's why for me, I interlinked authenticity into my idea of confidence, was because I felt if I'm trying to be like someone else, it's almost a false confidence, because I may be I'm building confidence based on an idea of something else that I don't really know much about. Whereas if I can do it authentically, I know who I am, then it's really true confidence, because I'm just being me. I am just being me. And then whether that's good enough or not in the sporting world, when the outcomes come, who knows? We'll see. But yeah, I think those athletes, they just embrace that. They embrace their inner weirdo. They're just weirdos, right? They just got these strange things about them, and they just embrace it.
Well, what's fascinating, right, is you'll see them maybe in a social environment and they don't know how to engage.
True.
They're at like a cocktail party, or they're at an after hours party, and they don't if they're not doing their craft, they don't know how to. So, again, May 4th, may the 4th be with you, this light side and dark side of the force. Like, the light side are those that love it. It's the ones that say, when given an opportunity to go to the movies with my friends, or go, sneak into the gym and hit another 100 free throws, they're like, I have more fun doing that. It's just, that's what gives me a sense of passion and pleasure. And that's that motivator. But equally so is the other side of the force, where I'm a tortured soul until I've got this perfected. It's almost like, both of them, it's about time on task. See, I don't think you can get away from mastery. Like, yes, the game comes easier. Like you were talking about athletes that are super strong, fit. I would almost make the argument that some of those folks tend not to be the best athletes, because the game came so easy to them, they didn't have to perfect their craft. And then when everybody else is as big, strong, and as fast as they are, when they finally catch up to the other competition, they don't have the foundation in place because they didn't put time and task. Like, tall guys in basketball have a really easy time at youth levels because they can kind of just hold the ball up. And now all of a sudden, when they're going up against everybody else that's tall, it becomes, well, oh man, all that footwork that I didn't put time into is now really coming against me, because I'm going up against other tall guys who did put the time and footwork. So it goes back to what keeps people on task, and that can be to alleviate the torture, or it could be the pursuit of the pleasure of like, man, it just feels so good to be in that space.
It's really interesting with younger players as well. Like I've got a couple of young athletes I work with, and one is, for his age, he's massive compared to everyone else. Like, he's just grown way faster than everyone else. So knowing things around like relative age effect, and for him, I'm so conscious of him seeing all of the external outcomes go his way right now, and it be a reason and a motivator to not necessarily put in the effort. So I'm really pushing for him to be up against people his similar size, play against guys that he could potentially compete in that way, so that this doesn't happen. So that this idea of when undoubtedly the playing field gets leveled, that he's kind of ready for it.
Yeah.
He's kind of there. And I think that's something it's something I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of young athletes come through the ranks, and they're like the child prodigy. They've got everything that they've been about them, that people have said this guy or girl has got something going for them, really exciting. And then they kind of get to that moment where everyone's caught up and there's an adversity, and they're just not ready for it. They haven't faced it. They haven't had it yet.
So it's interesting when we talk about youth athletes, and I'll be honest with you, I've never worked with youth athletes. I've only worked with elite like elite college and pro. But what I found is so many of the young men and young women that I've worked with, sometimes what brings them to me is they don't love their sport. And so I get parents and coaches at the youth level that go, hey, do you have any advice or any guidance? And I'm like, well, I try not to be an advice giver. I try to be, again, more of a question guy than an answer dude. But one thing that I will share is I'll say, if you've got a player who has an intrinsic love for the sport, a fire in their belly to do it, try your best not to mutate that into an extrinsic experience. And they'll say, well, what do I mean? I say, well, like if they win the game and you take them to go get ice cream afterwards to celebrate, instead of them just enjoying the process and really loving the game, they're going to now tie that the game is to going to get ice cream afterwards. And then same thing is when they lose and you no longer get the ice cream, it's now we're taking the fire in their belly and we're kind of putting it outside of them. And what I find is, and you'd be surprised, I think most people would be surprised, at the professional level, at the elite level, at the college level, there's more athletes that do not love their sport than you would think. They're just doing it because it's the only thing they know how to do, and it's the only thing they know how to do well, because that's what everybody just kept them doing it, and then they kept rewarding them for it. And so it was like, you know what? I dated the prettiest women, and I wouldn't have had that if I didn't play my sport. I got all this time and attention. I was very popular. Like all of this kind of external reward. And what's interesting is once they get to the pro level, they'll sign that, like in the NFL, watch out for the second contract. Like if you want to take a look at some research. So for those that aren't your listeners that don't follow the NFL, your first contract is your rookie deal, but it's your second contract where the NFL pension kicks in, and pension, like you get paid for life like that. And the second contract's also where, the rookie deal is all based off a formula that someone else has already calculated. The second contract's where you can really negotiate your max value. So what's really interesting is you watch some players who, when they sign that second contract, that max deal, their play goes to another level. They go, hey, I don't have to worry about all of those things. Everything else is taken care of. My family, my wife, my children, my parents, all my problems, not all my problems are solved, but a lot of the things that money can help manage, I've now got clarity. I can focus on ball. And then there's this other group where their performance goes significantly down. They go, I got paid, and what I got paid for was all the bull stuff that I had to engage in to get this far. All of the crap in high school and in college, all the stuff that I had to endure and hate, this is my payday that justifies that painful process. And now that I've crossed the finish line of that payday, I'm not going out there and getting hit ever again.
Right. Wow.
So
interesting.
Yeah. Another way to watch the NFL is watch the second contract. And when you watch a player go up, you're like, oh, that guy loves ball. And when you watch a player go down, you're like, there you go.
They've achieved this thing that they wanted to get done.
That's right.
So just, I'm very conscious of time, like how this moment's flying by, and just with the NFL draft, I want to segue into the AIQ. So for those who wouldn't have gone through it, just if you can, in a snapshot, explain what the AIQ is and its inception and where it came about from.
Yeah, so I think we can do this one of two ways. I think this is why I've been on Dan Abrams' show multiple times, right? Is what's the old expression? If I had more time, I would have written a shorter novel. And I think something I could probably improve upon is being more succinct in my thoughts or in my answers. I think something that I enjoy about the podcast format is we can go into depth. And I think the depth is fascinating. So my apologies for being long-winded, but it's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
No, I loved it.
So, one option I would offer is we can have a teaser here and do a second one that's strictly on intelligence, because I think intelligence and the AIQ has it's a fun thing to kind of dance and play with. Or if you want me to give you kind of like a 5-minute touch point, we can talk about the AIQ in 5 minutes. What would be your preference?
If you're up for coming back, let's do a teaser. and I'd love to go into some depth around intelligence, and I'm sure there could even be some follow-up questions that come from this episode and some follow-up thoughts. So I'd love to have you back if you're willing to do that.
This has been a ton of fun, and I think doing a deep dive in what is the contribution of intelligence to sport, I think can be a lot of fun. We can go into some depth on that discussion too. I'd be happy to do it.
Awesome. So if you've got a teaser, roll tape, and yeah, that we'll see what people, well, if any questions come from it before we lead into it.
Sure. Tune in next week for an exciting installment. No, look, this is what I would say. I think a comprehensive athletic profile that's oversimplified would come with 4 domains. There's physical. Are they big? Are they strong? Are they fast? Then there's experience. Do they understand the system that we currently play? So in American sports, let's use the NFL because the draft that just ended, is let's say the University of Alabama uses a system that's very similar to the professional, the NFL team. So, hey, grabbing this linebacker from this system is going to fit us. So a good concrete example of that is if you look at the Philadelphia Eagles, they basically just drafted the Georgia, University of Georgia's defense. They've got 3 or 4 guys on that defense. They just keep drafting because it's that system in Georgia is our system in Philadelphia. So we'll just keep taking those players. The third bucket is personality, psychological makeup. Are these guys going to be locker room poisons? Are they going to be great glue guys and leaders and all the stuff that we just kind of went down the rabbit hole of confidence and everything else? What's their character? What's their personality? And then the final bucket is intelligence. And intelligence is how do they go about solving the puzzle? So you'll see this, right? Big, strong, fast guys that go the wrong place at the wrong time. Or then you have these dudes that they don't really pass the sniff test. They don't look like players, but whenever they're out there, they're perfectly executing the task. And the question is, how are they doing that? So if you think about things like a firefighter who kicks a door down and has to scan the room for threats and danger, where's the fire, as well as victims, who do we save? I think that's very similar to, say, a footballer, American football or European football, who's scanning down the field and identifying where are my teammates, where are my opponents, how do I navigate to get the ball to where it needs to get to? Or cricket, cricket's got a lot of pattern recognition to it, right? Those at bats, we're looking for any kind of minute detail or information from the bowler. Am I using that? Did I use the right term?
Totally, yeah. Well done.
I mean,
you could have said pitcher. Then I'd have pulled you up on that.
Oh, pitcher better than bowler?
No, bowler is right. Pitcher is not right.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
So, but you're always looking, right? You're looking for maybe how he might grip the,
Oh, it's huge. Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah, it's huge.
So that's a form of intelligence. And I think intelligence, though it is one of the greatest predictors of success, there's a ton of literature. I like to think of intelligence more as a descriptor, which is if we understand how this person thinks, we can really maximize what we do with him and what positions we put him in for success and everything else. So what is intelligence and what do we do with intelligence to really develop the best version out of the athlete?
And would you even have sort of ways in which, from this work, that you've found that people can improve their intelligence within their given domain?
So it's an interesting debate. There are some that believe in neuroplasticity. See, this is where we can go deep, right?
Yeah.
Some people believe in neuroplasticity, so you can do brain training things. Some people do not. They think intelligence is a genetically stable trait. Either way, it's like hardware versus software. What I think you can do is you can change someone's ability to solve the process. You can change cognitive performance. You can speed up pattern recognition. But I'm not so sure you can change their intelligence. So the idea here is you can't make a tall person taller.
Yeah.
But if the nature of the task is to get something from the top shelf, you can take a short person and give them a step ladder. or a bench to stand on. And similarly, if you have somebody who's got an intellectual deficit, it's not that you're all of a sudden going to give them some kind of brain thing that makes them super smart. But what you can do is you can give them mnemonic devices that can help. So for example, like let's say like your memory is bad, like you're just bad at remembering names. We know from the research that when you tie other pieces of information together with names, it'll help you remember not just one, but two pieces of information. So
yeah,
like if I were to call you Lou instead of Lewis,
yep,
and I go Sweet Lou, because like let's say you love candy. So I go
yep,
Sweet Lou, loves to play cricket. And then I go Sweet Lou loves chocolate covered crickets.
Jesus.
But what I'm doing is I'm combining information into a story or a narrative. And now all of a sudden I've got your name is Lewis and you play
Yep.
the sport cricket downloaded because of that.
Yeah.
So there's things that you can do like that.
I'd be really curious to whether there's any research around it about environments that can increase intelligence or the common threads of those higher intelligence athletes, and whether there's common threads in what they've done in their talent development growing up.
Yeah, there was a benchmark book that came out a few years ago called The Talent Code.
Yes, I've read that. But Daniel Coyle?
Coyle, yeah.
Yeah.
And they explore a lot of these different environments that seem to keep producing high octane performers. And so I think they go into like the whole myelin sheath and the coding and the brain training.
Yep.
And so, there's some interesting concepts in that book. But like I said, tune in next episode.
Yeah.
We go into the depth of intelligence and how do we make people better with it.
I do. I think there's another question I want to dive into as well, if we can, sort of from our confidence chat.
Sure.
For next time, would be around people who are addressing athletes in the current state they are, and whether you alter their gameplay in that current state. Because let's say you've got athletes in your playoffs, those games come so fast, I can almost never get my head around it. That if you've got someone who is high in anxiety, do you change the way they play? If you've got someone who is just building their confidence, do they change the way they play in order to get to that confident place?
Yeah. So while we go back into this ether, I find one of the fascinating things that happens in the playoffs is the debate of, do you treat this like it's the same or do you acknowledge that it's different? So like in basketball, court is the same size, the rim is the same shape, the ball is the same weight. So you can say to everybody like, hey, this is just another game that you've been playing your whole life.
Yep.
The alternate to that is you go, no, this is different. Timeouts are a little bit longer because there's more TV attention. There's going to be a larger audience. There's a lot more at stake. There's a lot more people that are going to be asking for tickets and all these other things that make it different. And so it's funny because I'll have coaches that will ask me all the time, like, do we make it the same or do we make it different? Do we acknowledge a difference or do we try to remind them it's the same? And I think the answer there is it depends on the group. Some people might need to be brought back to, hey, this is the same. And others might need to be ramped up and going, hey, now we got to do +1 effort. So
how do you tell that difference? How do you know?
Well, as Sir Alex Ferguson once said, you can't escape the playing field. I think the players that need to be calmed down because they're overhyped. If the game's on Saturday, they're overhyped on Thursday. And you're like, dude, if you're at, on a scale of 1 to 10, you're at an 8 Thursday, we might need to kind of like revisit this. Otherwise, by the second quarter, you're going to be drained. Same thing. Yeah. It's like if someone's kind of just like, we've been here before or we've done it. And it's like, okay, how do we react to this more favorably?
Yeah, no, interesting. Really, really fascinating. Look, Scott, this has been insane. And I'm really glad that we'll be able to do another go at it. One real quick one that I always ask guests at the end of a show is there anything, whether it's a documentary, a quote, a series, a book, a film, anything that has inspired you that you recommend consistently?
One that's not oversaturated. One that kind of comes to my mind from some of our conversation that I think's a little bit more rare. I don't know if it's more rare or rare. The Bastard Boys of Baseball. It's a documentary. Like, if you want to talk about motivation and a bunch of guys that had a reason to play, I'll throw that one out there because I don't hear too many people referencing that.
I'm gonna go straight onto that. I've never heard of that one. That one's going straight into the.
The other one that I think is super cool, and I don't know why it's not getting more attention, is it's called Edge by Littleton. And Littleton's with a Y, Lyttleton. Like, I don't know why this book isn't getting more love, but I think that has some really neat stuff in it.
Okay, definitely going to look at that as well. Some top quality recommendations there.
I was just trying to go, that's like, those are my deep cuts. I was trying to avoid the stuff that maybe some of your other guests have already thrown out there.
For sure, don't go left field. Where's the best place to send people if they want to find out more about you, your work? Send them wherever is best.
That's a good question. I've never been much of a self-promoter, if at all, so I don't know where I would send people. So with the AIQ, our website is pretty easy. It's just aiq.team, and you can always contact me through that. My email address is sgoldman@aiq.team, so you can always just email me directly. I do have a presence on Twitter, but I'll be honest with you, I don't check it very much. So I do get DM'd a lot, but I'm not always quick to respond. But you can always, and I don't even know what my Twitter account is. I think it's like @ScottGoldman PhD or something. So
yeah,
you're welcome to do that too. Those would be two places to contact.
We'll throw all the links in the show notes. People can find them when they need them. Yeah. So look, really appreciate your time, Scott. This has been incredible, and I'm really looking forward to part 2.
Me too. This was fun. Thanks for everything. I really appreciate the conversation.